On February 7, 2026, Vladimir Putin made a threat that should have terrified the world. Instead, it triggered a NATO response so swift, so calculated, and so overwhelming that the Kremlin went completely silent for 72 hours. What happened in those 3 days changed the nuclear calculus of world. War 3 and Putin just realized he was not holding the cards he thought he had. This is the story of how a nuclear bluff became Russia's biggest strategic miscalculation since the start of the war. Ukrainian forces controlled significant portions of Kursk Oblast on Russian soil. The recent disaster at Sudza had cost Moscow over 3,400 troops in 2 weeks. Western sanctions were crippling Russia's economy. Oil revenues were down 40%. The ruble was in freefall. And perhaps most importantly, Putin's domestic support was cracking. Key opposition figures, even within his own government, were quietly questioning whether the war was winnable. Russian military bloggers, usually staunchly pro-Kremlin, were openly criticizing the failures in Kursk. Families of dead soldiers were starting to protest in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Putin needed something big. Something that would shift the narrative. Something that would remind the world that Russia was still a superpower. So he reached for the nuclear card. On February 7, 2026, during a televised address from the Kremlin, Putin delivered what Western intelligence would later call the most explicit nuclear threat since the Cuban Missile Crisis. His exact words translated from Russian. The West believes they can supply Ukraine with long-range weapons to strike deep into Russian territory without consequence. They are mistaken. Russia possesses the means to defend itself by any means necessary. Our strategic nuclear forces are on heightened alert. We will not hesitate to use all weapons at our disposal if the territorial integrity of the Russian Federation is threatened. This is not a bluff. The statement was broadcast simultaneously on every major Russian state media channel. Within minutes, it was trending worldwide. Western capitals erupted. Emergency meetings were called in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels. The UN Security Council convened within hours. Global stock markets plummeted. Gold prices skyrocketed. For the first time since 1962, the world genuinely believed nuclear war was possible. But here's what Putin didn't anticipate. NATO was ready for this. February 7, 2026, 21 o'clock UTC. The United States Department of Defense holds an emergency press briefing. The Pentagon spokesperson calm, measured, but unmistakably seriously delivers a statement that sends shockwaves through Moscow. The United States, in coordination with NATO allies, has implemented enhanced defensive postures in response to recent Russian statements. Let me be clear. Any use of nuclear weapons by Russia against any target will be met with an overwhelming and decisive response. This response will not necessarily be nuclear in nature, but it will ensure the complete strategic defeat of the Russian Federation. Read that again. Complete strategic defeat. Not retaliation, not proportional response. Complete strategic defeat. Western analysts immediately recognize what this means, and so does the Kremlin. NATO is signaling that if Russia uses even a single tactical nuclear weapon, say, a small nuke against a Ukrainian military target, the response won't be another nuke. It will be something worse. Total conventional annihilation of Russia's military. Think about what that means. Every Russian naval vessel in the Black Sea, Baltic Sea, and Mediterranean sunk within 48 hours. Every Russian airbase within 500 kilometers of NATO territory destroyed by cruise missile and airstrikes. Russia's command and control infrastructure decapitated by cyber warfare and electronic warfare. Russian ground forces in Ukraine circled and obliterated by combined NATO air and artillery strikes. And here's the genius of NATO's strategy. By keeping the response conventional, NATO avoids triggering a full nuclear exchange. Russia launches one nuke. NATO responds with overwhelming conventional force. Russia is left with a choice: escalate to full-scale nuclear war, mutual annihilation, or capitulate. It's a no-win scenario, and Putin just realized he walked into it. February 9th, 2026. While Russia's military scrambles, NATO's economic response begins. The European Union, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Japan, and Australia jointly announce an unprecedented sanctions package. Financial sanctions. Every major Russian bank still connected to the SWIFT system is immediately disconnected, no exceptions. All Russian sovereign debt held by Western institutions is frozen. Personal sanctions are expanded to include over 500 additional Russian oligarchs. Government officials and military commanders, their assets, yachts, real estate, bank accounts are seized. Energy sanctions. The EU announces an immediate ban on all Russian liquefied natural gas (LNG) imports, effective in 30 days. The U.S. Treasury threatens secondary sanctions on any country purchasing Russian oil above a $40 per barrel price cap, down from the previous $60 cap. India and China, Russia's biggest oil customers, receive private warnings from Washington, continue buying Russian oil, and face restricted access to Western financial markets. Technology sanctions, export controls on semiconductors and advanced technology to Russia are tightened further. Any company found violating these controls faces asset seizures and criminal prosecution. The Russian ruble collapses 15% in a single day. The Moscow Stock Exchange halts trading. But the real damage isn't economic, it's psychological. Russian elites, the oligarchs, the ministers, the generals, are watching their wealth evaporate in real time. And they're restarting to ask a very dangerous question. Is Putin's war worth this? February 10th, 2026. This is the moment that changes everything. Chinese President Xi Jinping holds a rare phone call with President Putin. The details of the call are not officially disclosed, but within hours, 3 things happen. 1. China issues a public statement. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs releases a statement urging restraint and dialogue in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The statement specifically mentions the dangers of nuclear escalation and calls for all parties to step back from the brink. This might sound neutral, but in diplomatic terms, it's a rebuke. China is publicly distancing itself from Russia's nuclear threats. 2. Chinese state media changes tone. For the first time since the war began, Chinese state media outlets begin running stories critical of Russia's military performance. Articles appear questioning Russia's strategy in Kursk and highlighting civilian casualties. 3. China quietly reduces economic support. According to Western intelligence, China instructs state-owned enterprises to slow purchases of Russian oil and reduce financial transactions with Russian entities. It's not a full cutoff, but it's a warning. Why does China do this? Because Beijing has been watching NATO's response very carefully. And China has realized something critical. If Russia uses nukes and NATO responds with conventional annihilation, China gains nothing. China's economy is deeply integrated with the West. A full-scale NATO-Russia war would devastate global trade, crash markets, and potentially drag China into a conflict it doesn't want. Worse, if NATO demonstrates it can conventionally destroy Russia without using nukes, that sends a very troubling message to Beijing about any future conflict over Taiwan. China needs Russia as a partner, but not at the cost of its own economic and strategic interests. So she delivers a private message to Putin. Back down. You've overplayed your hand. February 7th to February 14th, 2026. For 7 days, the Kremlin says nothing. No new threats. No press conferences. No defiant speeches from Putin. Russian state media suddenly shifts away from nuclear rhetoric. Instead, they focus on diplomatic efforts and dialogue with reasonable partners. Behind the scenes, frantic back-channel communications are happening. Russian diplomats reach out to intermediaries Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, asking them to convey messages to Washington and Brussels. The message is always the same. Russia does not seek escalation. Russia is open to negotiations. But NATO doesn't publicly respond. They just keep the pressure on. American B-52 bombers conduct routine training flights along the edge of Russian airspace just close enough to be detected by Russian radar. British and French naval vessels continue patrols in the Black Sea and Baltic Sea. Polish and Baltic states continue military exercises on Russia's borders. The message is clear. We heard your nuclear threat. Here's our response. Remove. And Putin realizes he doesn't have one. Let's break down exactly why Putin's nuclear threat backfired so catastrophically. Miscalculation number 1. Putin thought NATO would be paralyzed by fear. For decades, Russia has relied on nuclear threats to deter Western intervention. During the Cold War, it worked. Mutually assured destruction mad kept both sides cautious. But this isn't the Cold War anymore. NATO has spent the last 2 years preparing for this exact scenario. They've wargamed it. They've planned responses. They've built the military infrastructure to execute those plans. When Putin made his threat, NATO didn't panic, they executed. Miscalculation number 2. Putin thought he could divide NATO. Russia has long believed that NATO is weak, fractious, and easily divided. They thought countries like Germany, France, or Italy might balk at confronting Russia over Ukraine. They were wrong. The nuclear threat had the opposite effect. It unified NATO like nothing else could. Even traditionally cautious members like Germany immediately supported the hardline response. Miscalculation number 3. Putin thought Russia's nuclear arsenal gave him invincibility. Russia has approximately 6,000 nuclear warheads, more than any country except the United States. But here's the problem. You can't actually use them. Use a tactical nuke, and NATO responds with conventional annihilation. Use strategic nukes, and you trigger global thermonuclear war, and Russia gets annihilated too. Putin discovered that nuclear weapons are a deterrent, not a tool of coercion. The moment you threaten to use them, you reveal that you have no other options. Miscalculation number 4. Putin underestimated the economic consequences. Russia's economy was already struggling. The new sanctions pushed it to the breaking point. And when China, Russia's most important economic partner, started backing away, Putin realized he was isolated. Miscalculation number 5. Putin forgot that NATO has nukes too. Russia isn't the only nuclear power in this fight. United States, United Kingdom, and France all possess nuclear arsenals. Combined, NATO has roughly 5,000 nuclear warheads. If Putin uses nukes, NATO can respond in kind. Mutually assured destruction still applies. By making an explicit nuclear threat, Putin reminded NATO and the world that Russia doesn't have a monopoly on nuclear weapons. This incident will be studied in military academies for decades. Here's why it matters. 1. Nuclear threats have lost their power for 75 years. Nuclear weapons have been the ultimate deterrent. But Putin just proved that, in the modern era, nuclear threats can backfire. NATO demonstrated that it has the conventional military capability to destroy Russia without launching a single nuke. That changes the entire calculus of nuclear warfare. 2. NATO is more united than ever. Russian propaganda has spent years claiming NATO is weak and divided. This crisis proved the opposite. Within hours, 31 NATO member states coordinated a unified military and economic response. That level of cohesion is unprecedented. 3. China is not willing to support Russia unconditionally. Beijing's subtle distancing from Moscow is a huge strategic blow to Putin. Russia needs China economically and diplomatically. If China starts pulling back support, Russia is truly isolated. 4. The nuclear taboo has been reinforced by responding so decisively to Putin's threat. NATO reinforced the global norm against nuclear weapons use. The message to every nuclear-armed nation is clear. Threaten nukes, and you will face overwhelming consequences even if you don't actually use them. Putin's domestic position is weakened. Russian elites are not stupid. They saw how NATO responded. They saw the economic damage. They saw China backing away. They're starting to question whether Putin is leading Russia to victory or to ruin. Rumors of dissatisfaction within the Kremlin are growing. Putin's grip on power is not as secure as it was a month ago. As of today, February 14th, 2026, the crisis has de-escalated for now. Russia has not made any further nuclear threats. NATO has maintained its heightened defensive posture, but has not escalated further. But this is not over. Putin is cornered. The war in Ukraine is not going well. His economy is collapsing. His allies are wavering. His own people are questioning him. Cornered leaders are dangerous. Some analysts believe Putin will attempt a negotiated settlement offering concessions in exchange for sanctions relief and a face-saving exit from the war. Others believe he will double down, launching new offensives in Ukraine to prove Russia is still strong. And then there's the darkest scenario, Putin, facing domestic unrest and potential removal from power, decides he has nothing left to lose. History shows us that desperate autocrats make desperate decisions. On February 7, 2026, Vladimir Putin tried to intimidate NATO with nuclear threats. Instead, NATO called his bluff and made Moscow go silent. This wasn't just a diplomatic victory. It was a demonstration of strategic superiority. NATO showed the world that it has the military capability, economic leverage, and political unity to counter Russian aggression without resorting to nuclear weapons. Putin wanted to scare the West into backing down. Instead, he reminded the West why NATO exists in the first place. So here's the question everyone is asking. Will Putin learn from this humiliation and seek a way out of the war? Will he escalate even further in a desperate attempt to save face? And even more troubling, if Russia's nuclear threats no longer work, what will Putin try next? This crisis may have de-escalated, but the war is far from over. What do you think Putin will do next? Will he negotiate, escalate, or is this the beginning of the end for his regime? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your analysis. If you want to stay ahead of every development in this war, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story is about to get even more intense.